And this is a lot to take in sometimes, because going into the existential burden that life can bring sometimes, we go to Buddhism's Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is the truth of unsatisfactoriness, or as some have translated it before, the truth of suffering. Now, suffering is not necessarily the most accurate translation, but it is the truth of life being unsatisfactory. That we, at times, will have insoluble problems, things that we believe are problems, but things that we just cannot seem to solve in our lives. And the states of being that cause this to be are the state of unsatisfactoriness or insoluble problems, the state of impermanence, and the state of what is called non-self. Now, non-self is a state that we want to be able to achieve, something that's discussed in Zen, as very likened to what we were discussing before with that universal identity, with not attaching to any specific identity to define yourself. By doing so, there are certain problems that will come up that suddenly they become problems to you because they are going against your identity, or they violate the identity, or they're in conflict with the identity. The idea of permanence, or impermanence rather, is a state that is important to realize, because a lot of the suffering that we experience in that first noble truth is because we try to make permanent that which is not permanent. And Zen, when you think about Zen, it can be summed up in a single phrase: everything changes. And while that seems very simplistic, the suffering happens because we don't realize that sometimes not everything needs to be solved. And we don't realize that nothing is permanent. And the other thing that we don't realize is that we are not a specific identity or something that we can attach to. This is a made up thing that we have in our society. It's worth explaining the viewpoint that Zen Stoicism holds on the ego, right? A lot of people have brought this concept up through years. It especially comes up now, where sometimes one way to insult somebody or to discredit somebody is to say that this person has a big ego. And when we think about the egoic view, we'll explain the definition like this: the ego is the measuring device of the subjective individual experience. It is not the individual experience itself, but it's how we measure the quality of it, and it's how we make distinguishing or a distinction between our experience and another's experience. It's how we know when we're drinking a glass of water that we bring the glass of water up to our own mouths rather than someone else's. So the ego is not the individual experience, but it's how we identify and measure it. It's how we point to it. So just like the finger pointing at the moon, the experience of us is pure consciousness and awareness, whereas the ego is the thing pointing to the individual subjective consciousness and awareness that is happening right now in this moment. So in order to create non-self, it is important to understand that. It is important to step back from the ego to be able to not have a limited or a restricted identity, and to begin to have a universal identity. So using the view from above is one way of doing this. And in order to move through this without getting attached to things is to also realize that life is impermanent, and that impermanence is part of what makes it beautiful. So that's the first noble truth. It's the truth of suffering, or the truth of unsatisfactoriness. The second noble truth is that the root of suffering is that the root of suffering, and there's a few different translations for this, but the root of suffering is attachment, or said differently, it is clinging. And it's usually clinging to one of these three things. It's clinging to a problem that can't be solved, or it's clinging to permanence and trying to make something permanent when it's not, so it's attaching to it, or it's clinging to identity. It's clinging to a state of you, or an idea of you that isn't really you. And that's part of why we use philosophy, is to scrape off the stuff that isn't you, scrape off the stuff that you maybe have been identifying with, but doesn't actually define who you are. So that is the second noble truth, is that the root of all suffering, the root of unsatisfactoriness, is clinging to these things. The third noble truth is the truth of nirvana. Now, nirvana, people will hear that and they think, oh, that means enlightenment or something. And yes, nirvana is that state of enlightenment that people talk about. But what nirvana really means, and what it's translated as, is to blow out, to literally exhale, and to let go. So when we let go of that which we cling to, of that which we identify with, and we let it go and we let it just pass through us, that is when we begin to fall into this state of total presence here in the now. And that is what in Zen they call satori, this idea of sudden enlightenment. When you just let go of something, you have a moment that breaks all of these attachments, that breaks the clinging to the impermanent, that breaks the clinging to the insoluble problems, and that breaks the clinging to the limitations that you have maybe assumed over your identity. And the fourth noble truth is the path to the end of suffering, or the path to the end of unsatisfactoriness, which is the eightfold path. Now, in Buddhism, they call it the Eightfold Path. We have a Zen Stoic version. And in the next episode of the Zen Stoic Path, we're going to be discussing and breaking down our translation of the Eightfold Path, one that we've brought into the modern age with modern examples. And we're going to be discussing what that means. And the Eightfold Path is a method of liberation. It's a way of liberation that when the Buddha created the Eightfold Path, he created it not to be followed necessarily sequentially, but to be these aspects of life that we can incorporate at any moment, that we are able to tap into no matter what's going on. So we're going to be getting into that in the next episode. The Eightfold Path breaks down into three aggregates. The first aggregate is the aggregate of wisdom or understanding. The second aggregate is the aggregate of conduct or morality. And the third aggregate is the aggregate of meditation or concentration.